Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we're going to look at an area of performance that is not discussed very often, but is surprisingly important to consider. Creating an interpretation that is cohesive, internally consistent, and emotionally fulfilling to an audience is a difficult job as it is, and it is definitely the focus of what we do on stage. However, in addition to the sounds we create, we are also loaded with the responsibility of creating a performance that communicates to the eyes of the audience, as well as the ears. The movements we make with our bodies, the focus we display with our eyes and head, they all contribute to a visual impression that the audience reads and interprets. And this can potentially help or harm the reception of the music that we are playing. The question for today's episode is, why does our stage presence matter? Let us first consider the most obvious and clear form of onstage theatrics that pianists tend to display. I'm going to play something, and as you're watching and listening, I want you to ask yourself, what is Andrew doing while he plays this section? Where is he looking? What do the movements of his hands and arms tell us about the music itself? And ultimately, what emotion or character is Andrew communicating through his posture and movements? There are countless examples of this kind of music in Liszt, where the theme is quasi-angelic and tender. If you listen to it without seeing me, the attention is focused on the sound created, the interpretational choices I've made, and so on and so forth. But when you actually see me perform, as you would any other performer, your eyes take into account my own physical actions at the instrument, and these can serve to amplify a musical effect. You may think it's too subtle to notice, but consider what happens if I play the music in a similar way with entirely different bodily movements that, in my view, are not sympathetic to the musical cause. Do you see what I'm talking about? It's a rather jarring effect, is it not? I'm playing music that is supposed to be quiet, loving, and tender. And yet, I look like I'm physically struggling at the keyboard. The music is almost static, with movements barely perceptible to the ear, and yet my body is moving everywhere, seemingly contrary to the whole atmosphere. This is very difficult to watch while we listen, because not only is it something that we don't expect, it is in every way quite distracting. Our ears tell us something, and our eyes tell us the opposite. What we want at a time like this is for the pianist to be as still as the music, to personify in their actions and composure the emotions being communicated through the music itself. If Liszt writes something heavenly, then we must be likewise pure and devotional. Which action looks more devotional? Looking placidly at the heavens, like this? Or staring down in concentration at the keyboard, like this. I would hazard a guess that you know the answer as well as I do. But we need to talk about precisely why this answer is not only easily understood, but seemingly universal in nature. Performing on the piano is quite a task. Not only do we have to deal with technique, accuracy, sound quality, and all the rest, but we also have to make up for the fact that we are stationary, sitting at a black box that is not particularly well decorated or aesthetically pleasing to look at. For most audience members, they are unable, due to their seating, to see both hands on the keyboard, or the full face of the performer. And furthermore, the design of the piano's lid dictates that the performer remains in direct profile to the audience. Unlike singers, or violinists, or anyone else who can carry their instrument, we pianists mainly stare at the doors to the offstage area, and we only face our audiences when we enter and exit. In my experience, the only performer who is worse off is the organist, who is usually in a loft somewhere far out of sight. But they usually have the benefit of a beautifully decorated and ornate church or cathedral to help them out. A piano on a generic wooden stage has nothing. What this means, of course, is that we must take this admittedly visually boring situation and make it less boring. If our audiences listened with their eyes shut all of the time, then we wouldn't have anything to worry about. But we're dealing with human beings. We observe with our senses, and sometimes we can't help but look, perhaps because it might help us to better hear what we think we're hearing. In the same way that we look at a person's mouth when they are speaking, if they're speaking very softly. In order to better decipher their words, we might look to a pianist to really see if they're still playing, even if it's very, very soft. This is vitally important to understand. It's more complex than this, of course. With music, we tend to take a holistic approach when it comes to emotional gratification, and I'd argue it comes from our most primal manifestations of our instincts. Dancing. If you hear a good beat, you'll tap your foot. If you hear a great beat, you'll get up and swing your hips. We want the music to influence us because it feels good. If we see musicians in physical sympathy to the music they're playing, then it almost reinforces and amplifies the feelings that may be generated within us, the listeners. Rock performers are masters of this, of course, but they have the ability to carry their guitars or microphone stands anywhere. Headbanging while playing a piano is ridiculous, for obvious reasons. But still, the point is clear. If we, as the audience, can see that the performer is being affected by the music they are producing, we are more likely to join in and feel the same. But what does this mean for the classical pianist, who is playing repertoire that is far more socially inhibited, far more complex intellectually, and ultimately reliant on dead silence from an audience? Let's go back to our example. The music itself is this. Liszt wants this to be sweet, loving, and obviously spiritual in the old romantic sense. It's written in the top register, without any real bass to it, similar to the metaphorical angel's choir. It also comes as a complete change of atmosphere from the previous section of the piece. I'll play the end of the previous section with the transition so you can hear what I mean. There's no doubt that Liszt is going for something special. A change from minor to major keys, from dark and weighty to light and elevated, from hell to heaven, so to speak. We could find more complex connections, of course, but the point is that we're not just dealing with simple emotions like happy or sad. We're communicating ideas like purity or resignation or trepidation. These are not blunt force emotions. They're veiled, always veiled. This leads to many different potential actions that we can take physically in order to communicate the music visually. Heavenly music, for example, when played by pianists, tends to result in pianists looking upwards, like this. Depending on the performer, they may look way up, as if in direct visual contact with a spiritual being. Or perhaps they may simply have their head raised, but eyes closed, as if they're in quiet communion with some inspirational agent. In all of these cases, their bodies are quiet and relaxed, because the music is quiet and relaxed. No herky-jerky movements. But why are we even looking up at all? Why does looking down seem so wrong? Looking upward for inspiration, spiritual or otherwise, seems to be something that is universally understood in humanity. In the same way that many cultures around the world recognize the clasping of hands as significant, or looking downward without making eye contact as a signal of submission and defeat. We recognize these behaviors in other people, and we use their posture as clues to help us identify how the person is feeling. To look up for inspiration may be universal because all of our primal experience involves being in communion with the ground. That the ground is a starting point for everything. That plants grow out of the ground, that we bury our dead in the ground. To look upwards is to look into the infinite, the unreachable, the untouchable. It's not very far-fetched. Looking upwards when we play a piece of music that is communicating something that is, for all intents and purposes, spiritual or elevated, means that we are in communion with the music, and the audience recognizes this and accepts it as a total package. That the music and the performer are one, and not separate things. When I demonstrated earlier the idea of the music saying one thing and the performer saying another, when I was looking at the keyboard in a stressed manner while playing still and elevated music, it created a terrible contradiction because the performer and the music were out of alignment. This is why it was so jarring to watch. Incidentally, we can find an example where looking down and having a seemingly stressed body can in fact serve as an ideal indicator of the music. Listen to the lead-up to the angelic section. This ending to the opening section of the piece is constructed to create as dramatic a contrast as possible when we move to the next section. This means that the music is somewhat halting in its movements. It's low on the piano, it's loud and heavy, and it's thick in texture. It would be very odd indeed to see a pianist play this with the same body movements as we would see when they play the soft, heavenly section afterwards. This seems wrong somehow. For music, so heavy and serious, we expect the musician to look down, for their body to be tense somehow, their movements laden with the weight of their artistry pulling them down. In other words, the music is heavy, and the audience should see the performer feeling heavy too. Now that we've seen these two extremes, let's talk about some really important issues surrounding our composure on stage, our stage presence. Theatrics are either a natural extension and exaggeration of how we must physically play the piano, or they are pre-practiced and tested movements that have nothing to do with the technique at all. One of them is involuntary, being dictated by our unique integration with the instrument, and the other is voluntary and done by choice. The end goal of controlling our stage presence is to get an emotional reaction out of the audience that is consistent with the emotional rhetoric of the music at hand. The examples I've given so far are somewhat universal in their interpretation. That's why I chose them. I think it's safe to say that nearly all of us feel the same way with this kind of music, and therefore our personal movements at the keyboard will end up being rather similar, though subtly different, of course, depending on the intensity of the interpretation we're trying to create. In other words, when playing spiritual, soft, slow music, our bodies tend to be very relaxed in order to create the soft, controlled sounds that we need. Given that we don't have to make sudden movements or gestures, and we're not jumping around the keyboard in a fast or exciting manner, we don't need our eyes, and they tend to relax. We might look a little higher than level. Some may look even higher than that, and others may simply close their eyes. But none of us will be looking intently at our feet. I would argue that these are our first kind of theater, that of a natural extension or exaggeration of how we actually play the piano when creating this kind of atmosphere or sound field. These extensions are generally involuntary to some degree. When we're on stage in front of people, the last thing we will be thinking about is how our body is moving. We'll be more worried about the notes we're playing, the sound we're creating, and so forth. More specifically, sometimes the gestures we make at the piano are as a result of the technique we require in order to control our sound quality. When we're playing loud chords and passages, for instance, our movements are usually much larger. In the second bar of this section, Liszt asks us to play an accented octave in the right hand. In order for me to produce a loud, accented sound that has a good sound quality to it, my personal technique requires that I use not only my forearms and elbow, but also my back, my hips, and my legs. It's physically impossible for me to play this with a still and static body, or with eyes looking to the heavens in a quiet way. I need to be mobile, active, essentially in concert with the music I'm playing. Now, I could exaggerate this if I wanted to be more theatrical. Every movement gets louder. Let's talk about this for a moment. Exaggerating our natural movements is not automatically a good or a bad thing. It's a choice that we make depending upon our audience and our hall. It's very easy in this day and age to criticize and condemn performers for performing. That's not what I'm here to do. When you're in an intimate performance setting, like a salon that seats 50 people, every small movement you make will be picked up by the audience in the room. They'll hear you breathe. They'll hear the mechanism of the pedal on the piano. And they'll hear every squeak of the bench you're sitting on as you shift your body weight to perform. There's no need, in this situation, at all, to exaggerate anything. You can play as if you're playing for yourself. But if you're playing on the stage of an opera house, where the audience may be sitting 100 feet away from you, your subtle movements are entirely lost to them. In this situation, you may wish to exaggerate your movements in order to better communicate the body choreography you have when playing the piece. Remember, if the audience sees you in communion with the music you're playing, the total artistic effect is always more powerful. The toughest thing to learn is how much you have to exaggerate, depending on the situation. Consider the pauses in the recitatives here. In my interpretation of the piece, I treat the first pause as a short pause, because it's in the first statement. Now, the uplift to the pause does not require me to do anything specifically different with my technique, aside from a longer follow-through of the arm for the longer note. But if I want to show a large audience in a big hall that this whole gesture is an important feature that Liszt is showcasing, then I have to exaggerate a bit with the rest of my body. In this case, the exaggeration is not for the sake of the sound quality at all. It's there to show the audience visually what is happening. This recitative section has 3 points like this, the third being the largest gesture with what I interpret to be the longest pause. Now, once again, any exaggeration we make here is not to directly generate better sound quality or improve the comfort of our technique. All exaggerations are now extensions of already existing technical requirements. We're showing off to the audience. If we look at the left hand, we have this. Something that is very common is to exaggerate the follow-through of notes before rests or pauses. So the left hand might look like this if we're performing. When we put it together with an exaggerated right hand, then we get theater with music. This is where we begin to sense the danger of all of this. The term showboating comes to mind, where a performer will exaggerate all movements that they have, all feelings they experience. To some audiences, this is desirable, to see a performer come alive, almost stricken and possessed by the music they create. To some audiences, this is a nightmare, and a performer in this capacity distracts from the musical purity that this audience may wish to hear. Once again, I'm not here to tell you which is better or worse. The degree to which any of us performers actually exaggerate our movements is, for the most part, a personal choice that has been shaped and determined by our previous performance experience, our teachers, and of course, the society we grew up in and learned to perform in. In some cultures, grand gestures on stage are not only appropriate, but showered with applause. And in other cultures, they're interpreted as signs that the musician on stage is not a serious or intellectual one. The only real mistake that can be made with exaggeration of gestures is when the music and the gesture are not in alignment with each other. If I make a grand gesture at a moment musically where there isn't justification for it, then the audience will surely recognize the discontinuity of emphasis and energy, and they'll interpret this as showboating or showing off just because the performer can. That's the line that I draw. Now, let's consider our second theatrical concern. These are about movements that are planned or practiced, and that are not necessarily extensions of how we feel or the technique we use to play, but instead are necessary, calculated gestures that are choreographed to invoke a reaction or non-reaction from the audience. When we finish the opening section in the bass of the piano, we have a pause on a rest, and then we begin the heavenly bit. Now, if we're just playing for ourselves, there's no reason that we can't do something like this. Watch me. What have I done? Well, I've ruined a pause, which is supposed to suspend all motion in the galaxy. If you listen to it with your eyes shut, the musical effect is fine and correct. But if you watch me as I play, you're distracted by my movements, and the silence is not interpreted for what it should be. In this case, I'm forced as a performer on stage to find a way to move through the rest, such that I don't disturb the atmosphere of the silence, and yet am able to get my body in position to play the next part of the piece. For me, this means moving very slowly, with the hands near the keyboard, as if I'm sneaking around a quiet building. This is an example of a very common element of modern piano performance, our relation, or lack thereof, to the instrument in the middle of a piece of music. Current performance tradition instructs us to keep our hands on the keyboard or close to it, as long as we're planning to play. If we remove our hands far enough, like putting them at a resting position in our laps, then it's a visual signal to the audience that we're done, and it's time for them to applaud. In order to prevent this, we have to find something to do during a transition in which we don't actually play any music. And yet whatever we choose to do cannot in any way distract or obstruct the audience from feeling what they are supposed to feel during that silence. In addition to all of this, we still have to project to the audience that we're involved in the piece in some way. During a silence, we have to look as if we're held by the silence and influenced by it. If we put our hands in our laps and look around freely, we destroy the illusion entirely. This kind of acting is not a prescribed thing. Each musician finds their own way of doing this. But it is a necessary form of acting that we all have to learn in order that we continue to project to the audience the emotional situation that we think the music generates. All of it, without us playing a note. Pauses are not the only area where we must act outside of our technique and feelings. Quite often we will encounter a false ending in a piece, where a composer has written what sounds like a great, triumphant ending, but in fact is asking us to play something afterwards, like a reminder or commentary on previous material. Now, the piece could easily end after the E major octaves. There's nothing at all musically to tell the audience that there's anything else coming afterwards. Furthermore, if we slowed it down towards the end, we could really give the impression that this is the final climax. And by adding in some exaggerated gestures of triumph, the audience would most likely immediately start to applaud and cheer. Unfortunately, as performers, we cannot allow this to occur, no matter how we actually play the material, and thus we are forced to choreograph our body movements so as to visually indicate to the audience that it's not the end at all. Like the previous example, we cannot finish the octaves too high or with triumph, and we have to maintain some closeness to the instrument to show that we're not done yet. In other words, no movements of our body to indicate visually that it's over. If you want to be more clear about it, or in other words, if you don't trust your audience, then you can move to the bass rather quickly after the gesture. The movements of the pianist at the keyboard are akin to the costuming in a play. Even if the audience doesn't understand what the actor is saying, they can see from their costume that they are good or evil or comic relief. Our choreography at the keyboard is generally understood in the same way, though many people who go to a concert will never think of it in this manner. They won't even notice stage presence unless something goes wrong. This is not to say that great pianists have always done this. There are many pianists throughout history who had a nearly non-existent stage presence, where they would sit still at the piano at all times and blend in and disappear. There's nothing wrong with that when the music they produce is exceptional. My concern about this topic, and the reason I think it's important for us to discuss it, is because there's a rather common belief that stage presence is something that is above critique, solely because it is an extension of the personality of the pianist. That as an artist, one can do anything, because it is a byproduct of their artistic spirit or soul. Granted, this belief extends to nearly every artistic field today, and it is a very difficult belief to debate. How can we critique the actions of an artist if they feel their action to be right? This is a subject best left for another episode. But for now, I'll say this. When you're in front of an audience, you have the responsibility of controlling everything that happens on stage, from how you walk, to how you play, to how you smile. Everyone is looking at you, and therefore, nothing that you do on stage can be cavalier or empty of meaning, or else the audience will see you as empty and cavalier. In the same way that you will carefully craft your musical interpretation, making sure that each decision you make is backed up by evidence of some kind, you should apply the same rigor to the gestures you make on stage, thinking of the potential effect these gestures can have on an audience, and how that audience interprets the music they hear when they see you perform. It's vitally important to think about this, because the wrong gesture at the wrong time can ruin a great performance. When we trust our feelings before our intellect, we are thinking in the moment. We're not thinking about what happens after. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and try filming yourself when you play, just to have an eye on how you present yourself. Don't be afraid to critique this part of your performance. It's, in some ways, as important as playing the right notes. Bye for now.